At its lowest point, Barnes & Noble was written off as yet another Amazon casualty. Stores were closing, CEOs were cycling out, and sales were crumbling. But today, Barnes & Noble is now having a major comeback. New stores are opening, revenue is up, and they're in major growth mode. I'm Sammy Cohen, and this is Social Currency, a podcast that unpacks the stories that are shaping business, culture, and the intersection of the two. Today, we are going to unpack the comeback story of Barnes & Noble. This turnaround is being led by one of the most unconventional CEOs in retail, a man who actually saved a dying bookstore chain in the UK and is now exporting his indie-inspired playbook to the US. I view this Barnes & Noble tale as one of the most interesting retail comeback stories, and ironically, they're even buying up old Amazon bookstore locations. So today we will be unpacking this unexpected plot twist. This is both a comeback story and a case study in brand redemption, retail strategy, and what it takes to actually survive in the Amazon era. And beyond the world of books, this may be a playbook for how to bring back physical retail for other categories as well. To understand the fall and the comeback, you first need to understand how Barnes & Noble became so big in the first place. Barnes & Noble actually started way back in 1873 as a small bookstore in New York City. But the modern version we know today began to take shape in the 1970s when a man named Leonard Riggio bought the store. He had a big vision to create a national bookstore chain that could make books more accessible and more profitable than ever before. Riggio's genius was in applying big box retail thinking to bookselling. He built massive stores, some up to 60,000 square feet, and stocked them with everything: bestsellers, classics, textbooks, magazines, and even CDs and DVDs if you were old enough to remember those. Suddenly, bookstores weren't just cozy indies on the corner. They were destinations. In 1987, the company made its largest acquisition, 797 retail bookstores, when it purchased B. Dalton Bookseller, making the company a nationwide retailer overnight and the second largest bookseller in America. The next decade was fantastic for them. They became a publicly traded company in 1993 and continued to grow throughout the 1990s, adding an e-commerce website, bn.com, in May 1997. You didn't go to Barnes & Noble to grab one book. You went to browse, to hang out, and maybe even study or go on a date. And their expansion continued. In 2001, the company purchased sparknotes.com, a leading study aids website, and in 2003, Sterling Publishing, which had been operating for more than half a century and had a deep library of titles in print. At this point, Barnes & Noble had over 700 stores and was generating more than $5 billion in revenue a year. They had their own publishing division, a loyalty program with millions of members, and deals with Starbucks to put cafes in nearly every single location. Now, it's important to pause here and talk about the other side of Barnes & Noble's rise, because truly not everyone was cheering them on. In the 80s and 90s, as Barnes & Noble exploded nationwide with its superstores, a lot of independent bookstores suffered. These big box stores had more inventory, deeper discounts, and better locations. And they often moved into the towns and cities where small, family-owned bookstores had been operating for decades. The American Booksellers Association even filed lawsuits against Barnes & Noble and Borders in the mid-90s, accusing them of unfair competition and illegal publisher discounts. The fear was clear. These chains weren't just growing, they were crushing the competition. In fact, from 1995 to 2000, the number of independent bookstores in the US dropped by nearly 40%. It was a retail land grab, and the shopping mall era was booming. And Barnes & Noble was one of the biggest forces driving the indie bookstore extinction narrative. And for a while, they were on a tear. By 2004, they were the largest book retailer in the world. They had just launched an online store to compete with Amazon, and their biggest competitor, Borders, was already starting to struggle with debt and overexpansion. But here's the twist. Barnes & Noble's greatest strength, its scale, would eventually become its greatest weakness. When the winds changed in retail, it was stuck with hundreds of massive stores, expensive leases, and a top-down corporate model that made it slow to adapt. Now, it's easy to laugh now and say that they were too big, too corporate, but At its peak, Barnes & Noble wasn't the villain, it was the hero. It got people reading. That legacy is what made the comeback possible in the first place. Barnes & Noble had the size, the brand recognition, and the customer loyalty. But then the cracks started showing. The beginning of the end came in the mid-2000s, and like so many other retail tragedies, it started with one word, and that word is Amazon. As Amazon ramped up its book business, Barnes & Noble's tried to compete with it on price and convenience, but here's the problem. As we all know, Amazon wasn't just selling books. It was selling everything with personalized recommendations, one-click checkout, and eventually Prime 2-day shipping. Barnes & Noble couldn't match the speed, scale, or margins. Instead of doubling down on what made its in-store experience magical, Barnes & Noble got scared and reactive. Like so many other companies that have come before it, it went after a category that was completely out of their wheelhouse. They decided to create their own tech product. One of their most ambitious plays was launching the Nook. In 2009, Barnes & Noble launched this Nook e-reader as a direct competitor to the Kindle. And at first, it did look promising. Nook sales were strong in the first few years. But internally, the company lacked the tech DNA to scale it. Software updates lagged, the user experience was clunky, and it had to compete not just with Amazon, but with Apple and other tech companies too. In 2012, the Nook segment generated $933 million in revenue. However, by the following year in 2013, Nook sales dropped by 34% across the Nook division, and they were losing hundreds of millions of dollars on these devices. And while they were busy trying to play catch up in tech, they took their eyes off of the in-store experience. Here's where things got really messy. From 2010 to 2018, Barnes & Noble cycled through 5 different CEOs. Each one brought a different vision, but none of the visions stuck. One wanted to pivot to education, another focused on e-commerce, one even tried expanding into board games and vinyl. Now, without a cohesive strategy, the stores started to feel confused. The book selection was generic, stores looked outdated, staff morale plummeted, and loyal customers started drifting away. All of this meant that the sales started to fail. And between 2012 and 2018, annual revenue dropped from around $7 billion to $3.6 billion. Hundreds of stores closed, the stock price fell more than 80%. But what was even worse was that they had no moat. As Borders went bankrupt and liquidated their stores in 2011, Barnes & Noble had the perfect opportunity to swoop in. They bought the Borders trademark and other intellectual property. Now, this could have been a really unique opportunity for them to take over the entire physical bookstore space while focusing on their efficiencies. But instead, they faltered, overspending on tech, underinvesting in their stores, and failing to tell a compelling brand story. What's wild is that during the same period, independent bookstores were actually making a comeback. The American Booksellers Association reported a 49% growth in the number of indie booksellers from 1,651 in 2009 to 2,470 in 2018. And this is because people wanted something that Barnes & Noble had forgotten how to offer. They wanted curation, community, and connection. So here was Barnes & Noble's dilemma. It was too big to feel indie, too slow to feel modern, and too scattered to feel special. They closed roughly 150 stores between 2008 and 2018, and the original Fifth Avenue store closed in 2014. By 2018, most people thought that the company was on a steady decline. But then came a plot twist that no one expected. A British bookseller who'd once competed against Barnes & Noble was brought in to save it. And the CEO had a completely different playbook, one that wasn't built on tech, but built on trusting the people inside of the stores. The company didn't need a new CEO with a flashy PowerPoint deck and a new vision to take the company in yet another new direction. It needed someone who actually understood what it meant to sell books and why people still crave bookstores in the first place. Enter James Daunt, a man who ironically spent years competing with Barnes & Noble just across the Atlantic. James wasn't your typical executive. He started his career as an investment banker at JP Morgan, but in 1990, he left to open a small indie bookshop in London called Daunt Books. It had old oak bookshelves, travel sections organized by country, and staff who actually read the books that they recommended. The store became a cult favorite. And in 2011, when the UK's biggest bookstore chain Waterstones was flailing in the same way that Barnes & Noble would later, James Daunt was brought in to save it. And James didn't believe in the centralized corporate buying. He didn't believe in stores that looked exactly the same. He didn't believe that price cutting was the way to win. Instead, his philosophy was simple: let bookstores be bookstores. And that meant giving power back to local store managers, letting them them choose what to stock based on their own customers, redesigning stores to feel warm and unique, and empowering staff to build community, not just ring up sales. And in 2018, an investment firm called Elliot Advisers acquired a majority stake in Waterstones. And the following year, in 2019, Barnes & Noble was also acquired by Elliot Advisers, the same group that owned Waterstones. James Daunt was appointed CEO of both Waterstones and Barnes & Noble. Many people raised their eyebrows. Why would a British bookseller take over an American giant? Now, Elliot Advisers is behind the largest retail bookseller in the UK and the US, and there are lots of synergies there. They didn't bring James in to cut costs. They brought him in to rebuild trust with customers, staff, and publishers, and that's exactly what he did. James' first move was to eliminate the corporate one-size-fits-all approach to book buying. No more cookie-cutter displays, no more uniform floor plans. He let each store act like an independent bookstore. Suddenly, Barnes & Noble in Boston felt different from the one that was in Austin or LA. He also cut down on the clutter, less gift merchandise, fewer toys, and more books. And he redesigned stores to be less sterile, moving away from big box vibe and towards something more curated. Before James joined the team, Barnes & Noble accepted payments from publishers to place specific books in prominent locations near the entrance or the windows. This practice, which is often referred to as pay-to-play, helped publishers prioritize specific titles in high visibility spots within the store. However, Barnes & Noble has since abandoned this practice, opting for a model where the books themselves, rather than payments, determine the placement, which is ultimately the best for both the stores and the readers. And maybe most importantly, James rebuilt the feel of what it was like to be in a Barnes & Noble bookstore. He made booksellers feel proud again. Customers were noticing, and publishers did too. And slowly, the numbers started to change. What made James so effective wasn't that he had some revolutionary retail formula. It's that he respected the art of bookselling. And in an era of data and algorithms, that actually turned out to be his biggest competitive advantage. The next chapter, Barnes & Noble starts to grow again, and not just survive, but thrive, which brings us to the comeback. So did Daunt's indie-inspired playbook actually work? Shockingly, yes. In fact, the Barnes & Noble comeback might still be one of the most surprising retail rebounds of the last decade. After nearly a decade of contraction, Barnes & Noble is finally back in growth mode. And not just in theory. Last year, Barnes & Noble opened 57 stores and acquired a well-known Denver bookseller called Tattered Cover in Colorado. This means that they opened more new bookstores in a single year than the company had opened from all of 2009 to 2019. And this year, the company is planning on opening over 60 stores. And what's even more symbolic is the fact that Barnes & Noble started taking over former Amazon bookstore retail locations. Yes, you heard that right. Amazon once tried to replace Barnes & Noble, and now Barnes & Noble is literally replacing them in the physical realm. So how did this happen? It wasn't just one thing. It was a whole series of strategic shifts under Daunt's leadership. And just to name a few, there was the decentralized buying. Store managers now choose inventory based on what their community is reading. It makes the stores feel more personal and relevant. There were store redesigns. Layouts are now open, browsable, and inviting, less like a warehouse and more like a curated experience. There's less clutter. They cut back on toys, candles, and trinkets. The focus is back on the books and discovery. Book-loving employees are encouraged to make real recommendations. Think indie bookseller energy, not Target retail script. And of course, BookTok. BookTok tables and Gen Z friendly marketing is massive for Barnes & Noble now. Yes, they are actually tapping into TikTok culture. You'll walk into a Barnes & Noble now and see trending BookTok reads front and center. And because of all of this, revenue has now stabilized. Customer foot traffic is up, and publishers are actually excited to partner with them again. Even longtime skeptics in the industry are saying this feels different. And maybe the most shocking part is that James did all of this without closing a ton of stores or laying off entire departments. This wasn't a slash and burn private equity job. It was a long game based on rebuilding trust and taste. And what's fascinating is that in trying to act less like a chain, Barnes & Noble suddenly became cool again. It tapped into what independent bookstores have always done best, which is create spaces for discovery, for community, and for that just one more book feeling. Gen Z readers, many of whom never even saw a Barnes & Noble in its prime, are walking into these these redesigned stores and falling in love with the experience. It's fresh to them, and it's giving the brand a second life with a whole new generation. Barnes & Noble didn't beat Amazon by playing the same game. It won by playing a different one that prioritized people, curation, and experience over algorithms and convenience. And now, instead of being an outdated retail dinosaur, Barnes & Noble is quietly showing an entire industry how to bring analog back and win. So Barnes & Noble pulled off the ultimate comeback. But what's next? Is this just a temporary rebound, or are we witnessing the rebirth of a retail giant? If you zoom out, the Barnes & Noble turnaround isn't just about books. It's about a bigger shift happening in retail and culture and in how we want to experience things. For the past decade, everything was about going online, faster, cheaper, more convenient. But now we're swinging back. People want to browse. They want physical spaces that feel human, cozy, and local. Just look at the rise of record stores, indie coffee shops, and even Polaroid cameras. Barnes & Noble is perfectly positioned for this, and it's not just a store, it's becoming a modern-day third place again. Somewhere to wander, discover, and reconnect with offline joy. And what's fascinating is that the digital world is actually being fueled by the physical. TikTok is driving millions of people back into bookstores, and Barnes & Noble saw this early and leaned in hard, curating their own BookTok-inspired displays, partnering with trending authors, and turning viral moments into real-world foot traffic. This hybrid model, where online discovery leads to offline purchase, is going to reshape major retail strategy over the next 5 years. And here's a leadership lesson. When you trust the people who are on the ground, they build the business with you. James didn't just redesign the stores, he redesigned the bookstore culture. And that's what's keeping the customers coming back. You can expect to see more companies copy this bottoms-up model, especially in industries where local context, taste, and human connection actually matter. In a world obsessed with algorithms and scale, Barnes & bet on something wild, creating a desirable in-store experience, and it's paying off big time. This isn't just a story about books. It's a story about belonging, about why places that feel personal, that feel real, are starting to win again. So if you haven't been into a Barnes & Noble in a while, maybe it's time to go back. You might be surprised by what you find. And that's a wrap on the unexpected comeback of Barnes & Noble. I'm so excited to hear your thoughts. If you're listening to this on Spotify or YouTube, you can comment directly on this episode. And if you're listening to this episode anywhere else, you can let me know your thoughts on the Instagram clip that I'll be posting from this video. See you next week. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Social Currency. I've been wanting to launch this show for so long. I can't tell you how excited I am to do this and how thrilled I am that you're actually here listening. It means the world to me. If you liked what you heard today, please rate and review the podcast because it massively helps to support the work I do to bring the show to life. And if you want to keep up with the hottest business lore in real time, follow me on Instagram at Sammy Cohen Talks and subscribe to my newsletter, Social Currency, which is linked in the show notes. Social Currency is a production of Social Currency Media and Money News Network. The podcast is hosted and executive produced by me, Sammy Cohen. Social Currency is produced by the Money News Network team. See you next time.